Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special series of podcasts discussing Cox Automotive's second Insight Quarterly IQ for Q3 2024. I'm Philip Nothard, Insight Director at Cox Automotive, and I have the pleasure to be joined today by Lee Swinerd, who's Director and Head of Automotive at Interpath Advisory. Hi, Lee, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Phil. Yeah, no problem. Happy to join.
Plenty going on in the sector at the minute. Be it small changes, little impacts, but keeping us probably both busy in many ways.
Yeah, very much so. And we're seeing a real spread of requirements from our clients at the moment. It's not just sort of the manufacturers and the supply chain, but sort of getting into the dealers, the financiers, the leasing companies, etc. as well. It's having quite a lot of impact at the moment, and it's pretty hard to try and keep up to date with everything that's going on, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we're talking about volatility, we've got the uncertainty, what happens, this complexity that's playing out quite a lot, because as you say, and we'll get onto a little bit later, but these small changes can have big, significant impacts right across the sector.
Yeah, I think normally you expect a change to have a ripple effect. That's natural. But I think one of the problems that we have is that sometimes decisions are being made without a full view of the total consequence, and you fix one problem, but you create potentially an even bigger problem somewhere else, and we'll probably touch on one of those items later on, I think. So but yeah, trying to understand the big picture and through the whole ecosystem. It's not just about if you make one change here today, yes, it will affect the OEMs, but then how does that ripple through to the dealer network and then the used car supermarkets and everybody else? Because they're all reliant on fundamentally cars being produced by the OEMs
and ultimately the consumer at the end of all this, which we'll get on to. So we say there, the idea within these interviews is we're going to discuss the key takeaways and insights found in the latest Insight Quarterly, which you can read on the Cox Automotive European website. This interview will focus on the challenges facing the ICE component supply chain. They're touching it on a little bit there, the fluctuation of to electric vehicle demand, OEMs push for EV adoption. Before we get onto some of the bigger complexities around it, let's look at what's been happening over the last few years around that sort of vehicle supply registration by fuel type, and how these changes around fuel supply, whether it's petrol, diesel, full battery electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, is starting to influence what's happening to the sector. What stands out the most for you, Lee, in these changes over recent years?
We have to look back at what's happening today reflects various changes in policy over the last 20 years. I can very clearly remember as a company car driver 20 years ago, being encouraged really to go down the diesel route because it was deemed to be lower in emissions. You got a better benefit in kind rate as a consequence, and then it was worked out that actually NOx emissions were probably worse for the environment than CO2 emissions, and so we started to dial back the move into diesel. Just back only as far as 2016, which is only 8 years ago now, there was pretty much parity on registrations between diesel and petrol. Now we're down to, in 2023, I think the latest data there was we're down to 7% for diesel registrations. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily what the consumer wants. I think that's what the consumer is having to buy, and because of availability of product from the OEMs. And there's a bigger picture around the OEM push of product versus one type of product versus another type of product. So for me, I think that's really what is reflecting, as you've had change in government policy, and that can date back as far as the Kyoto Protocol back in, I think it was 97, then the Paris Agreement in 2015. You have the CAFE emissions regulations, then you have, Boris Johnson talking about sort of, zero emissions by 2050. All of these things play into what we're seeing today.
You touched on it a little bit there around those the broader shift in this change around the marketplace for the automotive sector. But a couple of times we've mentioned consumer, and this is influencing consumer preferences, because as you say there, this is legislation, regulation led, manufacturer push side of things, but it isn't necessarily consumer preferences. It's not a consumer choice, is it, that's playing into this?
No, very, very much the case. I'm a strong believer that the OEMs have looked at the direction of travel in terms of legislation around greenhouse gas emissions, etc., and that has set their strategies and agendas. And as a consequence of that, what they are willing to make and make available to the consumer gets influenced by those long-term strategic decisions. I think there was also, if we go back to pre-COVID, if you look at, say, 2019 as an example, you still had a lot of mass market vehicle production, a lot of vehicles going into the market, not just in the UK but globally, big sort of push of metal into the market. And then we hit COVID, and then the semiconductor shortages in particular, and I think that allowed the OEMs to sort of reset their business models. And by doing that, they could then say, right, okay, what do we make money in making? And it wasn't small cars, it wasn't small diesel cars, it was larger vehicles, but it also allowed them to sort of, perhaps use a slight excuse that, because of the shortages, you've got a very long wait time on a diesel, but actually you can have a nice shiny BEV in 3 months rather than wait 12 for a petrol or a diesel vehicle, which we were all hearing those stories back in 2021, 2022. So, and then it also allowed them to change the narrative towards BEV as well. I just think about the advertising that you see for cars on television, and, probably from about 2020, 2021, it was very clear this push into alternative fueled vehicles at that point. There was no advertising at that point going, oh, look how great our diesel engines are.
Moving into the bigger picture, and you mentioned right at that whole point, this ripple effect. With the growth of battery electric vehicles or FEV with a plug-in hybrid vehicle registrations, I mean, what challenges do you foresee for manufacturers, OEMs, and dealers as we approach this first level of the ZEV mandate, which is 22% for cars and 10% for LCV in 2023, and then scaled up from there? What do you see as the big challenges for the sector?
There are a number of manufacturers who have already stated they really don't want to be paying £15,000 per vehicle fines for not hitting the ZEV mandate, right? Which is understandable. And so therefore they're going to have to adopt a different strategy. Yes, they can buy, certificates to help with that from other manufacturers. But fundamentally, I always see there are two parts to the equation. The first part is how many, alternatively fueled zero emission vehicles you sell. The second part is how many ICE vehicles you sell. And so you can try as a manufacturer to influence both of those parts of the equation. Certainly you can incentivize buyers and consumers to take a battery electric vehicle through pricing support, through the dealers, or as we're seeing now, Phil, some of the leasing schemes that we can see from some of the manufacturers, are unbelievably good deals at the moment. And that's clearly an incentive to try to register those vehicles, as part of that equation. What we're probably going to start seeing, and I know you've referenced this in the past, that, do we start seeing a constriction in the supply of right-hand drive ICE vehicles over the coming months to try again to influence that equation? And how much, again, going, if you get into Q4 this year, how much pre-reg activity are you going to see to try to pull forward some BEVs into this calendar year just to try and make that equation work?
I mean, you touched on it a little bit there. We look at the current pace of BEV and plug-in hybrid adoption, very much, governed by fleet rather than private registrations. The industry, do you believe the industry is on track? What are these potential roadblocks? Given 2024 into 2025, the situation doesn't change unless we start to change the pace of transition.
I think it's going to be incredibly challenging for the OEMs to hit that 22% target this year. I think, there are some very smart people, much smarter than me, working out how that gets done and how you can minimize the impact of it. Do I think overall we'll hit 22%? I think it's probably unlikely, unless there is as I said, go back to my previous comment, unless there's a big constriction in the supply of ICE in Q4 or for the rest of this year, and perhaps a lot of tactical pre-registration activities and stuff to hit that number for 2024. My concern then becomes, well, okay, you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. If you're taking registrations in December 24, what are you going to do to demand in Q1 2025? And let's bear in mind that 2025 goes up to a 28% target from a 22% target. So that in itself looks very tricky without anything else happening, and you've got to look at why adoption is being more difficult than perhaps people expected it to be. If you go back and look at a lot of technology advances over the years, there's been studies that have sort of stated that when you get to, with a new technology, when you get to about 13-14% adoption by the general public, it then becomes an exponential growth at that point. Everyone wants one, right? Because they can see the benefit of it, they can see how good it is, and it's so much better than the previous product. That doesn't necessarily exist at the moment. I don't think in consumer eyes that the BEV product is a better product than an ICE product. And they're like, well, why should I switch? It's not massively cheaper to run. They're much more expensive to buy. I've got range anxiety and we don't have the infrastructure. There's probably an urban myth potentially around battery health and how long battery packs last, and so there's a whole load of building blocks that are just not there to encourage the consumer to switch from an ICE to a BEV. And I still think one of the biggest ones of those is cost. If you look at the average price of a battery electric vehicle at the moment, it's of over £60,000, right? That is not a cheap purchase for anyone, particularly when we're in a cost of living sort of crisis, let's call it, at the moment as well. Affordability is getting really, really difficult.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there is this whole, cost of entry, cost of ownership, alongside whether it's urban myth or not, this anxiety, the range anxiety, the battery health issues, warranties, and things like this, all playing into that consumer mind as around that vehicle ownership. The benefit in kind takes a little bit that way, because to be fair, it's not their vehicle, it's not them to worry about. It is a subsidized vehicle that they're getting the use of in many ways. So you can tick some of them boxes.
And that's why perhaps the leasing model starts coming in, because people say, well, it's not my problem. I'm just going to pay a couple of £100 a month to use this vehicle, and I'm okay because I've got no residual value risk. I don't care about the longevity of the battery. Now, if you're the leasing company, that may be not an ideal scenario, because if people aren't protecting the batteries, then perhaps those batteries do have a higher degradation rate than they would if you or I bought it as our own personal vehicle.
Switching back to the ripple effect and the broader automotive industry in the wide sense, and thinking about OEMs' strategies towards government policies and targets around the Z mandate, and very much playing into your area of expertise, the impact on the supply chain, because these vehicles have millions of suppliers across the production market for OEMs, some with significant long lead times from all kind of levels of that supply market, as we saw through the pandemic when we had those challenges around the chips and other suppliers. What's your view at the minute, and how are the OEMs, tackling these challenges?
The supply chain needs good visibility of what the vehicles are going to be and approximately what the volumes are going to be. That's how they best operate. Now, the point here is that as the adoption slows, the OEMs have talked to the suppliers and they've said, this is what we think the rate of decline is on petrol, and this is the rate of increase of BEV. When that gets pushed to the right because adoption is slower than they expected, if you're a supplier of ICE components, you're saying, right, hang on. So you might want us to try and push the program out for a year or two and carry on with an existing program. Actually, that's not a bad place to be sometimes, actually, because if you were working on a 7-year program cycle and actually you're into year 8 or year 9, actually you should make reasonable money on that. The problem becomes, though, that I've seen this in the past where engine programs in particular have been pushed, and extended and extended and extended. The equipment on which those parts are being manufactured are deteriorating. So your maintenance costs go up. You have more machine breakdowns. And if you have a machine breakdown, how does that impact on, the just-in-time supply chain? And therefore, do you start stopping OEM production lines as a result of your machine breaking down? So, and then there's a cost of all of this as well. So, so that's one impact, that level of uncertainty. But if you, on the longer term, but if you look at the short term, as we were saying earlier, if the OEMs are saying, right, I'm not going to make right-hand drive ICE vehicles for the next 4 months, that would be a really damaging short-term hit to any supplier. These businesses require volume to recover their overheads and make profit. And if you take vehicles out of the production cycle, then that's when suppliers really start to struggle. And that's when the OEMs, what we're seeing here is the OEMs are having to support the suppliers in some instances. We are seeing suppliers go into insolvency processes, not just in the UK, but across Europe as well, and North America. It is commonplace. The second challenge that this creates as well is, if the adoption is slower, most of the OEMs were very bullish 3-4 years ago. I'm going to release all of these programs in 23, 24, 25, 26. We're already seeing those OEMs start to push those new BEV programs to the right. Maybe instead of being 25, it's 26 or 27 that these vehicles will come to market. Problem is, because of the long lead time on development, the suppliers have already committed to the capital expenditure that's required to build those programs. They've perhaps, geared up in terms of head count, et cetera, for the new programs. And then you're saying, actually, we're not going to start that program for another 12 months. What do you do with that overhead? And again, I think the OEMs are being reasonably sympathetic with their suppliers by saying, look, it's our call, it's our decision. And they're trying to work with their suppliers to come up with a position which is okay for everybody, right? But it's not going to be ideal.
It's not commercially viable long term, is it? You know, you've got these manufacturers of components, be it from, I mean, engine blocks are the probably one of the big obvious ones, because you know you've got these manufacturers that produce engine blocks for the petrol and diesel vehicles that have been in a steady decline. Now you might be able to switch from a diesel to a petrol, but there is no use in a full battery electric vehicle. So how, you know, it's kind of to your point, they've got to be commercially sustainable to continue. And it's not that they're just going to stop them tomorrow from producing engine blocks. They've got to phase through, but keep them financially in business to continue producing those engine blocks for the fewer vehicles that they need.
Well, the associate challenge, that this is when automotive kicks in as a global industry and not just a local industry, because we're talking a lot about BEV adoption and ZEV mandates and everything here today. That's the UK, it's Western Europe, it's North America. But actually, you know, the manufacturers are still going to be supplying petrol and diesel engine vehicles into other parts of the world, you know, for quite a considerable amount of time, because those kind of countries will not have the electricity grid and infrastructure to support battery electric vehicles. You know, they want basic vehicles that are easy to repair, you know, et cetera, and so you then get this almost two-tier strategy where you will still need engine blocks, but you just won't need as many engine blocks. And so you will see consolidation of suppliers, you will see failure of certain suppliers, but there will still be a supply chain for ICE components for 15, 20 more years, and if not longer.
And to a point where they'll be required, you know, that if the UK doesn't need them, or vehicles coming to the UK don't need them, there's these other marketplaces outside of UK, outside of Europe, that will need them, which might not be efficient in terms of distribution and locality of those manufacturers that currently provide engine blocks. So yeah, I think I agree, it's all changing. Let's switch a little bit and think about, you know, tax structures, because again, this plays a lot into your area of expertise and things that you're involved with. But you know, we've got, where do you see, you know, future tax structures evolving to replace fuel duty income for the UK government? You know, we know that it's been on a decline significantly over the years, and you know, you talk about that petrol and diesel decline. And do you believe these changes could potentially inhibit the adoption of EVs as we progress into the second half of the decade? Because where does the government get their revenue from when fuel duty is declining and they're still heavily reliant on that revenue for the treasury?
Yeah, it's something I've been talking about for a few years, to be honest. You know, since the mood was that we were going to start moving towards battery electric and sort of zero emission vehicles. So the revenue takes billions and billions every year. I'm not quite sure what the actual number is these days in fuel duty. As you said, that has been declining because mileage is generally declining as well, I believe. And there's been a freeze on fuel duty increases for a number of years as well. So at some point, a battery electric vehicle does not pay fuel duty in the way that an ICE driver does. Now, when there is talk about a mileage-based tax around battery electric vehicles, you get this commonly, you get this kind of shock and horror kind of, oh, how can they possibly do that? But actually, that's all fuel duty is anyway. You know, if you do not drive your car and you do not fill it up at the petrol station every week, you are not paying tax, right? And I can't see why BEVs, you know, a mileage-based tax on BEVs is really any different. But again, it's an education piece around, you know, most drivers and car owners today that actually you're just switching one thing for another. You're right. But messaging that is going to be really challenging for any government, whether it's the current government or whether it's the next government or whatever. But it has to be addressed. I think I did a back of a cigarette packet calculation once, where working out if you do something like 10,000 miles a year on a sort of average fuel rate of 40 miles per gallon or something along those lines, your VED would need to be about £1,500 a year if you had it as a one-off tax. Now, people would go, I'm not paying £1,500 just to put a car on the street, which is why you then have to go back to a mileage-based system, because that's fairer for those that are heavy car users versus those people who might use a car for, 2,000-3,000 miles a year.
And does this add? I mean, we talk about that second half of the decade, and there's things, we know there are things coming up in the short term. We've got budget at the end of October. There's questions around fuel duty, whether it will be frozen or released, and things like this. But we talked earlier on around this challenging of adoption, particularly in the private market for EVs. Timing is going to be very much the key on getting this right, of when this taxation on EVs enters at a time where affordability, cost of entry, cost of ownership, and the whole logistical infrastructure element plays into it as well.
Again, there's two sides to the equation here, isn't there? That there's the tax that you put on the BEV owners going forwards, but equally there's how much tax, i.e. fuel duty, do you put on the ICE owners as well. And so again, you can incentivize adoption of EVs through actually overtaxing ICE. So use an example. If you said it was 50p per mile in tax, fuel duty on ICE, but you could say it's only 30p a mile for BEV, people are going to start saying, oh, hang on, I'm better off. It's cheaper for me to own a BEV than it is to own an ICE vehicle. And again, government policy can influence this.
Yeah, it's going to get very interesting. I mean, just thinking ahead now, finally, looking ahead for, the key factors influencing the new vehicle market through the end of 2024 and as we go into 2025 and beyond, and particularly in the context of some of the data and the conversations that you've been having. What's your view now as we look forward?
So I think consumers haven't really cottoned on yet that actually the choice of vehicles and range of vehicles that they'll have to choose from is going to decrease in terms of ICE vehicles, because the OEMs are not investing in any new ICE vehicle programs, as far as I'm aware. It's that ship has sailed, right? And so therefore, you might get one, perhaps today you get 4 petrol variants of a model. Going forward, you might just have one petrol variant of that model. And if you want petrol, that's what you'll get, that one variant. Otherwise, you'll end up going down the BEV route. And I think that, that's clearly, an area that will influence future registrations. I've talked a lot about BEVs, haven't mentioned hydrogen deliberately. I think that's a debate for another day that we could have, Phil. But again, is BEV the right answer here? Don't know. But it's the
exit.
OEMs have gone all in, right? In reality here, a couple of sort of stayed a little bit, backtracked a little bit and have been more FEV kind of plug-in hybrid, sort of, halfway house. I'm not sure that's right. I think the cost of vehicles has to reduce. I think they're just becoming increasingly expensive, whether it's petrol, diesel, FEV, BEV, doesn't matter. They're becoming so complex. They all have gadgets in them that most of us never want or need. So, bringing costs down will help future registrations. I think it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese entrants and other other new entrants influence the market, because again, they could have a seismic shift in terms of if they price their models correctly. Go back to what I'm saying about the cost structure and affordability. I think there's also a number of the way that people procure and buy cars, I think, is fundamentally changing. You were talking about the private registrations being, I think they're 12% down year to date. But actually, the fleet sector, is fleet really fleet anymore? I'm not necessarily sure it is. I just think it's a different route to the consumer. Fleet used to be company cars, right? That's how I always used to perceive fleet. Whereas fleet now is all of the leasing companies. I think Motability also drop into that category. These are cars that are going to the end consumer, ultimately. And so it's just a different route to market. And I think because of affordability, it's a necessary route at the moment as well. People are having to go down that route. And then there's also societal change, how people use cars, how much they use cars. The younger generation, my son, for example, he can and does drive, but he could live without it at the moment if he really wanted to. You then have all of the likes of the cost of ownership is fundamentally high. Is it cheaper just to get Uber everywhere, or a taxi service or public transport? So all of these things I think will affect how vehicles are registered going forwards.
Yeah, no, I think there's it sounds like there's plenty more for more Insight Quarterly content as we move forward. So that, we've run out of time now. So that really is great conversation. Great to catch up with you, Lee, and thank you for joining us on this this interview. It's much appreciated. I think there's that gives us a lot of food for thought around what's happening going ahead for the automotive sector. So I say thanks for everybody for joining us in the first of our latest series of Insight Quarterly interviews. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion today between Lee and myself. And be sure to join us in the next episode. And if you can now, if you want to read more about what we've been talking about and what we've discussed today, then please do head over to the Insight Quarterly on the Cox Automotive website, and that can be found on coxautoinc.eu. So it's all there with all the context that Lee and I have been talking about today. So thank you for joining us today.